Today's daf is daf Ayin Hey, and we got up to Rabbi Shimon Gamliel Omer, which is approximately 15 lines down from the top. So the Gemara quotes a brisa in the name of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, Kol shatanose bito atanose almenoso. If you're allowed to marry the daughter, then you're allowed to marry the mother, meaning your almon. So the Gemara now goes back to the brisa, which quoted Rabbi Yossi, and asks the following question: what are they arguing about? Amar Ula, the debate is about ger amoni umoavi ika beinayu. Is a ger amoni or moavi posel bibiyaso? So we know that the Torah prohibited an Ammoni or a Moavi from Kahal Hashem, and a Jewish woman is not allowed to marry an Ammoni or Moavi even after he was misgayer. And now the question is, if she went ahead and she had a relationship with him, with this ger Ammoni or Moavi, would she become psula, and would her zera be possible? So Rabbi Yossi holds the following, that her psul depends upon the psul of zaro meaning for all generations to come. And in the case of a ger Ammoni Moavi, the Torah says that for all generations, the offspring are prohibited from entering into the kol. So that's called zera apostle. And even though that only applies to the zecharim, to the male children, but a female offspring would be allowed to enter into the kol based on the drasha of Ammoni velo Ammonis, etc. But nevertheless, that's considered enough, according to Rabbi Yossi, of zera apostle. However, comes along Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, and he says, no, it depends not only on the zera zachar, but also on the zera nekeva. And that's what he says, the psul depends upon bito. And since the bas of this relationship between a ger Ammoni and a bas Yisrael would not be psula, therefore the mother herself, who had a relationship with a ger Ammoni Moavi, is still kshera. Ushneim lo lamdu ela mikohen gadol b'almana. They both, Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon, derived their conclusion, respectively, from the case of an almana to a kohen gadol. If a kohen gadol has a relationship with an almana and he violates a lav, he also makes her, the almana, into a chalola, so that a regular kohen is allowed to marry an almana, but he cannot marry a chalola. She becomes a chalola because of the violation of the Isur lav when she had a relation with a kohen gadol. And now, based on this halacha, we're going to split in what we could derive from this halacha by analogy between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Shimon. To Rabbi Yossi Savar, Rabbi Yossi said that what is the paradigm of Kohen Gadol Balmana? What is it teaching us? When we say that a Kohen Gadol has a relationship with Almana, he parcels her through his bia, is Ma Kohen Gadol Balmana Shezaro Pasul, the zera from such a relationship is pasul, and pasul, he means there will be a psul from the zera in the case of a male child who's born, is posel bibiyaso. But Rav Shimon Gamliel holds no. Kimo kohen gadol b'almana, ma kohen gadol b'almana shekol zaro pasul. You want to say that the bia in the case of a ger Ammoni or a ger Moavi with a bas Yisrael is going to passel her? No. We depend upon kol sheposel kol zaro, and in the case of kohen gadol and almana, there's a din of posel kol zaro. So whether or not the child of that relation between a kohen gadol and almana is male or female, the psul is chal in the child. And that's why the almana herself, the mother of that child, is psula. But lafuke, this is to the exclusion of Geramoni Moavi, because there the Zaro is not possible in the sense of Kol Zaro. Only a male child would be possible, but not Nekevas having Shevis Lova Kol Diomamar, Moni Velo Amonis, Moavi Velo Moavis. Now the Gemara wants to clarify the din of the almana of a suffik chol. Omer of Chizda. Hakol modim the almanas Isa. So the word Isa means a suffik chol. And he went ahead and he had a relationship with a woman and then he died. What's her status? Psula kahuna. There's no machlokas in the Brisa about this case. She becomes psula lekahuna because of the relationship with a suffik chol. So the Kohen who had a relationship with this woman was a suffik chol. That's called, after he dies, almanas Isa. And now the Gemara wants to bring a proof to Rav Chizda that all the Tanoim unanimously in the Brisa agree that almanas Isa is psula. Man Mekil Bahani Tanoi in the Brisa, who is the Mekil? It's Rav Shimon Gamliel, who holds that a ger Ammoni and Moavi that had a relationship with a Bas Yisrael does not passel habib diyaso. And again, that's because according to Rav Shimon Gamliel, you need kol zaro. Uka Omar kol shatanose espito. If there's no psul in the bas, in the nikeva, from this relationship between a ger, Ammoni, and Almoni, or a Moavi and a Bas Yisrael, atanosias almanoso, the almana herself doesn't become possible b'biyah. V'chol she'i atanosias bito, I atanosias almanoso l'mute mai, l'mute almanas isa shepsul l'kuna. So a Kohen is not allowed to marry the daughter of a suffik cholol, and therefore, on the side that he, the Kohen, is a cholol, his bas is psul kahuna. And the Gemara now points out that Rav Chizda is lafuki min ahadi tanoi. In other words, even though in our brisa that records the machlokas between Rav Shimon Gamliel and Rav Yossi, there's no machlokas about a suffik chol, meaning almanas isa, that she's psula. However, midahani tanoi, we can have other tanoim that disagree. Tisnan, we learned in the mission in the 8th parak of Edios, hey, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Yehuda, Memesel almanas isa shekshera lekuna. In other words, even though there's a suffik cholol here, but nevertheless, if her husband was a chol, and therefore he would passel her to bia. In the case of a suffik cholol, we're not going to passel. And why not? My time at Havi Svek Sveka Lakula. Now, in this particular case, even though we're learning the Daf Yomi Shir, which is usually pretty superficial, we have no choice here but understanding this Gemara based on the Pnei Yoshua. What kind of Svek do we have here? There's a suffik in the Cholol, but his wife has no suffik, meaning her suffik depends upon whether he's a Chol or not. There's no second suffik here. And the Pnei Yoshua is Mechadish that the Gemara doesn't mean literally Svek, but it's Ke'en Svek, which means the following. That first we have to judge the Boel, in this case, the suffik Cholol, that's one suffik. And then through his bia, we have to now question what is the status of his almana. And she comes to the table with Hocheskes Kashrus, and therefore it becomes a new suffix, and that's called Svek Lakula. The Mishnah establishes in the name of Rabbi Eliezer, Vadon bevadon mutar. If two people have the same psul bevadai, then they can marry each other. So, for example, a mamzer can marry a mamzeres. However, if it's a vadon b'sfeika or sfeika b'vadon, or even a sfeika b'sfeika, so a shtuki wants to marry a shtukis, is also. Omar Rabbi Yehuda Rav Halacha Rabbi Eliezer, we're going to only be matir vadoim when there are definite psulim to marry each other. But any possible misafek, even zebazeh, is us. And now Rav Yosef, Rav Yehuda adds the following comment. Ki amrisi comment to Shmuel, when I presented this halacha, this psak halacha, Ki Rabbi Eliezer to Shmuel, Amar li, he responded and he said, wait a minute, Hillel shona asar yuchsin alu mibav l'kulam mutarim zebazeh, lavo zebazeh. We have a brisa that quotes Hillel that tells us that when Ezra came on Aliyah Shniyah and he brought Asar Yuchsin from Bavel, all of them are allowed to marry within each other, even those who psulim misafek. So it means that a suffix is allowed to marry a suffix, and a suffix is allowed to marry a psulvada. So that means that according to Hillel, Rabbi Eliezer is certainly not accepted la'alocha. How can you accept Rabbi Eliezer la'alocha when Hillel established that mutarim lavo zebazeh? And when it says Asar Yuchsin, amongst the list of Asar Yuchsin are not only psulei vade like moms, but even psulei safek like a shtuki and a sufik. So you see that they're allowed to marry. A shtuki and a sufik can marry zel or zel, can marry a mamzer. That's against Rabbi Eliezer. So how can you paskin like Rabbi Eliezer? Now, there's a machlokas between Rav and Shmuel. According to Rav, all the psulim are of Suffolk, are asurim v'vadai. And again, the psulim, the Suffolk, are prohibited zelazeh, meaning one something to another Suffolk. And that's based on the fact that Rabbi Yehuda quotes Rav as saying that we paskin like Rabbi Eliezer. Shmuel, on the other hand, says, no, we're going to paskin like Hillel, Asar Yuchsin, and Mutarim Zebazeh, based on the price of Hillel. So the Gemara now is going to find the stira of Rav on Rav and Shmuel on Shmuel. V'rami, the Rav ad Rav, the Gemara asks a stira from Rav's paskening here like Rabbi Eliezer to another statement of Rav, and Rami Shmuel ad Shmuel, and Shmuel, who doesn't accept Rabbi Eliezer, he contradicts himself elsewhere. The Itmar, as we learned, Arusa she'ibra. So now we have a case of a woman that's mureses, and she became pregnant. We don't know if she became pregnant through her orus or through another person. Any other person would make the vlad into a mamzer. Rav Amar vlad mamzer, and we treat the vlad as a mamzer because we assume that she had some relationship with another man. We don't assume that she had a relationship with the orus. And Shmuel Amar vlad shtuki. The status of the vlad is a suffix mamzer. We don't know if she had beer with the orus, who would be kosher, or with some other man who would make her into a mamzer. And the Gemara explains, Rav Amar vlad mamzer. Why? I'm saying, what are the repercussions? And it's all based on the fact that rov psulim etzla is mutar b'mamzeres. Therefore, if it's a male vlad from this pregnant arusa, he could marry a mamzeres. In other words, according to Rav, his status is that of a vadai mamzer. Ushmuel amar vlad shtuki. According to Shmuel, the vlad is a suffix because we don't know if he's a real mamzer. Maybe, in fact, his father is the arus. Now, if Rav is matir b'mamzeres in this case, then it seems that Rav elevates, if you could say it that way, the status of a suffix to a vadai. And that's not Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says the sveikas are also zebazeh and with a vadai. It was the Tanakama who said that the suffix has a din of a vadai. So therefore, how could Rav on the one hand paskin halacha like Rabbi Eliezer, who says that a suffix mamzer is not allowed to marry a vadai mamzer, And yet here, in the case of the child who's born to the pregnant arusa, he says that the Vlad is a mamzer and is allowed to marry a mamzeres. Wait a minute. That's like the Tanakam against Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer was certainly prohibited because it's a suffix bevada. And likewise, we have a steer in Shmuel, because Shmuel holds that the Vlad is a suffix and therefore also mamzeres, they're called shtuki, and that reflects the Shita Rabbi Eliezer. But he himself, Shmuel, paskined according to our record, like the Tanakam, who's matir all these surim zebazeh. And that's the price of Hillel. Avasar yuchsin mutarim zebazeh. So the Gemara first answers Epoch. Later on, we'll see the Gemara rejects Epoch. But right now, in Epoch, the Gemara is changing the gears in the Brisa, and we should read it. Rav Omar Avlad Shtuki, Shmuel Omar Avlad Mamzer, just the opposite. Now the Gemara asks the following question. So you're telling me that Rav is paskening like Rabbi Eliezer, and the Vlad is a shtuki, and also Mamzeres. Shmuel is paskening like the Tanakama, that the Vlad is muter Mamzeres because the Vlad is a Vadai, Mamzer Vadai. So the Gemara asks, Tarti Lamali, why did Rav and Shmuel have to repeat this machlokas twice? Once in the case of the Arusa who is pregnant, and once in the case of Pnuya Shezinsa. And the Gemara says, Tzricha, we need both. Di'itmar baha, if we only had the machlokas. Now this Tzricha is going to go on Ra in both directions. Di'itmar baha, if you only had the machlokas, the way it's in the Mishnah, and that's talking about a Pnuya Shezinsa, then we would say, baha kama Rav, here's where Rav paskins like Rabbi Eliezer. And he says that a suffix is also bevaded mishum derov ksherim etzla. In the case of Pnuya, most of the city are Jews, and therefore, in all statistical likelihood, she had beer with a kosher, meaning a Jew, and therefore the Vlad is kosher. And therefore, yet that's why Rav is machmir and does not allow the marriage to a mamzeres. In the case of Pnuya Shezinsa. Aval husband in the Brisa, when we're talking about Arusa, Dero, Psula, Etzla, anyone in the world would make the Vlad into a mamzer with the exception of one person, namely the Arus. Aim, I might think, Modi Lishmuel, certainly in this case based on Rov, the child is a mamzer, and therefore can be allowed to marry mamzeres. And if we only had the machlokas in the Brisa, in the case of Arusa, we would have said, Rav. Here, in this case of the suffix of an Arusa that became pregnant, we don't know who the father is. That's what Rav says that the Vlad is shtuki and cannot marry a mamzeres, mishum de'iko l'mitle be'aros. There's a very strong svara to say that despite the fact that he's the only person in the world who would not make the Vlad into a mamzer if he was the father, nevertheless, there's a certain likelihood that she probably had a relationship with the Aris himself. Aval Baha, in our Mishnah, when we're talking about Pnuya Shezinsa, we have no logical reason to say that the Vlad is kosher, because it's very, very possible and plausible that she would have had a relationship with anyone who was available, even a mamzer. Is Ema Modi Rav L'Shmuel. I might think that the Vlad is allowed to marry mamzeres in the case of Pnuya Shezinsa, where we don't have that svara to say that she had a relationship with a kosher, is Tzricha. Therefore, we need to review and repeat the machlokas shin Rav and Shmuel once in Arusa and once in Pnuya. Ibais Ema. Now the Gemara has a new possibility of reconciling the stira of Rav and Shmuel without saying Epuch. Li'olam lo tepuch. And according to Rav, the Arusa who became pregnant, the Vlad is a mamzer. According to Shmuel, the Vlad is a shtuki. But that's not a stira to Rav here, who paskins like Rabbi Eliezer. and says that a suffix posel is also an avade posel. My mamzer, what does the word mamzer mean to come a Rav in the Brisa? Lav mutar b'mamzeres. He never meant to say that this mamzer is allowed to marry a mamzeres. Ela di osur b'bas Yisrael. He only meant to say that it's a mamzer. He's a mamzer legabi one din, that he's not allowed to marry a bas Yisrael. But he's not allowed to marry mamzeres because we paskin like Rabbi Eliezer, who says that sveikas can't marry vada. Shmuel Amar Vlad Shtuki di Osir b'Bas Yisrael. And once again, there's no steer in Shmuel because Shmuel is going to say the Vlad Shtuki only with regard to the Vlad being Osir to a Bas Yisrael. But as far as Mamzeres is concerned, that's mutter because Shmuel holds like the Tanakama, who is Mater Sofik and Vada. Frek the Gemari Hochi. If even Shmuel, who prohibits the Vlad of an Arusa to marry a Bas Yisrael, Hainu de Rav, then basically there's no machlokes between Rav and Shmuel. Just like Rav said that the child is also a Bas Yisrael, so does Shmuel. And therefore, based on this question, the Gemara is now going to reinterpret Shmuel. Elamai shtuki. What does Shmuel mean when he says shtuki? Shemesashkin also midinei kahuna. It means that if he comes forward and he says that he's a Kohen, which means that the Urus was a Kohen, and she, the pregnant Arusa, points to the Urus and says he's the father, the Vlad is not miyuchas to the father, and he doesn't have the status of a Kohen. So Gemara is Pshita. You just told me that he's not allowed to marry Bas Yisrael. Why isn't he allowed to marry Bas Yisrael? Because you don't know who his father is. It's Hashtami Din Yisrael Meshaskin Le. And we say that we don't know who the father is in the case of a shtuki, and he's not allowed to marry Bas Yisrael, is then midin kuna miboy. You have to tell me that he's mufka from the dinim of kahuna. We don't even know who his father is. If we don't know who his father is, then for sure he's not a kohen. Ela my shtuki. Now the Gemara again reinterprets Shmuel in a different way. Shtuki means shemishaskin also b'nichtzei aviv. That if there are other Yorshim, when his so-called father dies, he has no right to claim a Yerusha, take the Yerusha out of the hands. And that means that if the Oris himself dies, then this Shtuki cannot inherit his father. Isn't that a double posh? We don't even know who his father is. So now is there a havmina that we would force the Yorshim, who are Yorshe Vadai, of the Oris to now give up their estate for this guy we don't even know who his father is? Lo tzricha de tofas. Here we have a loch that in the case of Sofik Mammon, if the person went ahead and he grabbed the Mammon with a taina, hey, you know what, this was my father, then the halacha would be that e tofas lo mafkida mine. Because since we have a suffix, we can't take it out of his possession in the case of a suffix. And Shmuel says, no, Motziyah mimenu. The Yad Ramah interprets that Motziyah miyod because he's a suffix Yorish. When you have a Vada Yorish and a suffix Yorish, the Gemara in Baba Basra formulates a principle of Ein Suffix Motziyah Vada. The Ritva goes a step further, and he says that the Tfisa itself is illegal. Why? Because you can only be Tofes when you have a Tainus Vada. But here, he himself doesn't know who his father is. Right? We don't have DNA testing. And therefore, that's not a tfisa. Iboy, same the Gemara offers another interpretation. If you're going to say the following, my shtuki, what does Shmuel mean by shtuki beduki? Which means you have to check his mother and go up 4 generations. Shabotkins as imo. So first we're going to ask the mother, who was the Boel? Right? Remember we had, you're not old enough. Anyway, we used to have vixens the one. Anyway, the imo bereska kosher devalti nemenes. And if she says that she had bia with the Orus, she's believed. Kiman, Kiram Gamliel. We go back to the Mishnah in Ksubas Daf Yud Gimel. Machlok Shin Ram Gamliel, Rav Luz on the one end, and Rabbi Yeshua on the other hand. Ha'amar Shmuel Chadazim. The Shmuel already paskined like Rabbi Gamliel. That mipianu chaim. That means if a woman is muberes of pnuya and she says that she had bia from so and so, then Amr Mativa Shaluba Zemish Plodi V'Kohen who Rabbi Gamliel, Rabbi Eliezer Omer Menes. She is believed. and that's called Tainus Bari. And we can assume that she retains her cheskes kashrus, and you can't passel her yourself. You go b'shul merein in emenes lo mipia anu chayim. V'omar Rav Yehuda mishmal lochik Kiram Gamliel, that she is believed. So why does Shmuel again have to repeat himself here and tell us the halach is Kiram Gamliel? And the Gemara says stricha de'imi hasam. If we only relied on Rav Gamliel in the Mishnah Ksubas that Machlokes between Rav Gamliel and Rav Yeshua, I would have said Hasam. There, Shmuel holds that she's believed because Rov Sheir Metzla. We're talking about a Pnuya Sheira. So in that city, they're mostly Jews, and therefore there's a Rov Sheir. But Aval Hacha, in the case of an Arusa, the Rov Psulim Etzla, meaning 99.999% of the world would passel her, because a guy passes her, an Eved passes her, etc., is Ema lo, maybe against the Rov, she's not believed, tzricha. Therefore, I need Shmuel to tell me that even against the Rov, she's believed. So it means that Bari plus Cheskes Kashrus overrides a Rov. Now the Gemara explains why Rabbi Eliezer, back in the Mishnah Daf Ayin Daled, holds that Kusim are not allowed to marry one to the other. Tanya, and this is a Tosefta in the 5th parak of Kiddushin. V'chein Rabbi Elazar Omer, Kusi lo yisa kusis. My time, why can't a Kusi marry a Kusis? They're both the same Shava b'Shava, same psul. Now Tosa says, I don't understand the Gemara's kasha here. Rabbi Elazar himself holds that Sveikum v'Sveikum is also. So Kusi is a suffix. We don't know what his status is. Is he Jewish? Is he not Jewish? So we should apply the principle of Sveikum v'Sveikum mutter. So why is the Gemara asking my time? Tosa's answers that Kusi is different than all other Sveikas that are mentioned in the Mishnah, because im shnei mamzerim harei mutar zeh v'afilu rak echad me'em mamzer hasheni lo havi, right? V'hasheni lo harei mutarim sheken ger mutar mamzeres. So why should you create an isa mimonavshah? If they're both mamzerim, then a mamzer is allowed to marry a mamzeres. And if only one of them is a mamzer, therefore we can't allow this marriage. Well, what are you talking about? Then the other one is a ger, right? The whole suffix is whether he's a ger. If he's a ger is mutar mamzeres, because we paskin like Rabbi Yossi that kahal gerim lo nikra kol. On Rabbi Yosef Hasua, the whole thing is derabbanan. Keger liachar asar doros. This is called nishkecha hagerus. No, it's after 10 generations, nobody remembers anymore that they were originally gerim. And therefore, the Chacham say you can't marry a mamzeres. Why? Because people are going to say that Yisrael is getting married to a mamzeres, a Yisrael kosher. Who remembers that 10 generations earlier there was gerus? Yisanya, we went to the Bryce of ger adasar doros mutar mamzeres. For the first 10 generations, when people remember that there's gerus here, he's allowed to marry a mamzer. Because as we said, the halach is like Rabbi Yossi, that kahal gerim lo nikra kol, and if a ger is allowed to marry mamzeres. But mikan v'elech, after the 10th generation, people have long forgotten that this was a generation of gerim. Also, mamzeres, the Rabbanan said he's not allowed to marry mamzeres, because people are going to say that Yisrael is marrying a mamzeres. V'yesh omrim ashishtaka shem avodas kochav mimenu. Till the name Akum is nishtakach, is forgotten. And what does it mean that shenishtaka shem geris mimenu? He says that it's a period of time that's longer than Asar Doros. So that's a chum. Amalei Abaye. Just 1 second. I just wanted to make sure. Is that a chumrah or a kula? The kula. Did I say a chumrah? I meant to say a kula. Amalei Abaye mi dami. Can you compare these two dinim of a kusi and a ger? Hasam, in the case of a ger that is not allowed to marry a giores, let's say, because one might be a mamzer, etc., is ger yashan. That's talking about a case where there were many generations from the gerus until everybody knows the yichud, right? And people don't remember the yichus of Gerim, and they think that he's Yisrael. Umamzeres chadasha, and people know that this woman is a mamzeres. Is Amri, the Roim, the spectators are going to come to the mistaken conclusion that Bar Yisrael, who the Konosim mamzeres, Yisrael is marrying a mamzeres, and the Rabbanan condone this marriage. But here, in the case of a kusi, both he and she are the same. And if somebody remembers that they're kusim, then he'll remember both of them are kusim. Somebody and doesn't remember the yichus of this kusi and kusis, and they assume that the Yisrael gemurim, and that's how he's machzik both he and she. Then it's not Yisrael who's marrying a psula, so you can't equate the dinim. Gemara now offers another alternative explanation for Rabbi Elazar. Eliki Rav Dimi Omar Rav Elazar. When Rav Dimi came from Bavel Teretz Yisrael, he suggested a new pshat in Rav Elazar who says that kusim can't marry each other. Savalok Rabbi Shmuel.